They believed no one on earth could defeat them. They were the rulers of Makkah, the guardians of the Kaaba, the masters of Arabia's wealth. But in the scorching sands outside a small place called Badr, their arrogance would meet a force they never expected. Long before the sun rose over the valley of Badr, and long before swords clashed in the desert that would become one of the most important battlefields in Islamic history, the story had already begun years earlier in the ancient city of Makkah, a city surrounded by jagged mountains and burning sands where caravans traveled like moving rivers of gold across the desert, and where the powerful tribe of Quraysh ruled with unmatched influence over trade, religion and politics throughout Arabia. And in those days, the leaders of Quraysh believed their power was eternal because they were the custodians of the Kaaba, the ancient house built by Prophet Ibrahim and his son Ismail, peace be upon them. And every year, tribes from across Arabia traveled to Makkah to perform pilgrimage and trade in its markets, bringing wealth, respect and influence to the chiefs of Quraysh who sat in their gatherings beside the Kaaba with confidence that their authority could never be challenged. Yet in the middle of this proud city, something had begun to change, something quiet but powerful, because a man known among them for his honesty and truthfulness had begun to call the people toward a message that shook the foundations of their society. That man was Muhammad ibn Abdullah, and his message was simple yet revolutionary. He called the people to worship only Allah, to abandon idols of stone and wood, to treat the weak with justice, to remember that wealth and status meant nothing before the Creator, and to prepare for a day of judgment when every soul would stand before Allah and answer for its deeds. And for the oppressed people of Makkah, this message felt like a breath of freedom in a suffocating society. But for the leaders of Quraysh, it felt like a direct threat to everything that kept them in power, because if people believed that all humans were equal before Allah, then the authority of Quraysh, based on lineage and wealth, would crumble. And so the chiefs of Makkah gathered in their councils and began mocking the Prophet with arrogance. One of the loudest voices among them was a man named Amr ibn Hisham, who would later be known to history as Abu Jahl, the father of ignorance, a man whose pride burned like fire in his chest and who could not tolerate the idea that a messenger had come from among the people he considered inferior to himself. And in one of their gatherings, he stood before the chiefs of Quraysh and said with scorn, "Look at the followers of Muhammad, slaves, weak men, poor people. Is it these people that Allah has favored over us?" And the men around him laughed because they believed that if Allah were truly sending a messenger, he would have chosen a man from the richest families of Makkah rather than an orphan who had grown up without wealth or political power. And their arrogance blinded them to the truth that was growing quietly in their own city, because while they mocked the believers in public, the message of Islam continued spreading in secret homes and hidden gatherings, where men and women whispered verses of the Quran under the cover of night. But the leaders of Quraysh soon realized that mockery alone would not stop this new faith, and so they turned to cruelty, a cruelty that would become one of the darkest chapters in the early history of Islam. Because in those days, if a slave accepted Islam, his master would drag him into the desert under the burning sun and torture him until he denied the message of Muhammad. And the sand of Makkah witnessed scenes that would forever remain in the memory of history. Among them the story of Bilal ibn Rabah, a slave owned by the brutal master Umayyah ibn Khalaf, who dragged Bilal onto the scorching sand at midday and placed a massive stone on his chest while shouting for him to abandon Islam. Yet even as the weight of the rock crushed his chest and the desert heat burned his skin, Bilal repeated only one word with unbreakable faith: Ahad, Ahad, meaning one, declaring the oneness of Allah while his master screamed at him in frustration. But Bilal was not the only one suffering for his faith. Another believer named Sumayya bint Kayat, an elderly woman who had accepted Islam with her husband and son, was stabbed to death by a spear in one of the earliest acts of martyrdom in Islam, becoming the first person to give her life for the message of the Prophet. And many others endured horrors that words struggle to describe. Men dragged across burning coals until their backs blistered. Families separated and beaten simply because they dared to say that there is no God but Allah. And yet, despite the brutality, the number of believers continued to grow because faith, once planted in the heart, cannot be easily removed by fear. And this terrified the leaders of Quraysh, who feared losing control over their society. So they devised a plan that would punish not only the believers, but also the family that protected the Prophet, the clan of Banu Hashim, and they declared a boycott that would last 3 long years, sealing a pact and hanging it inside the Kaaba, declaring that no one in Makkah would trade with the family of the Prophet, no one would marry them, no one would give them food or shelter, forcing them into a narrow valley known as Shib Abi Talib, where they lived under conditions so harsh that the cries of hungry children echoed through the night, while the chiefs of Quraysh feasted in the city nearby. And the companions later said that they survived by eating leaves from trees until the corners of their mouths were cut and bleeding like camels chewing thorns. Yet even during those years of suffering, the Prophet never abandoned his mission, because he knew that Allah was guiding this message toward a future greater than anyone could imagine. And eventually the boycott collapsed when a few compassionate members of Quraysh could no longer tolerate the injustice. But the hostility toward Islam did not end. Instead, it intensified year after year until Allah commanded the believers to leave their beloved city and migrate to a distant oasis known as Yathrib, a city that would later become known as Medina, the city of the Prophet. And the migration, known as the Hijrah, was not a peaceful journey, because as the Muslims prepared to leave Makkah, the leaders of Quraysh blocked their paths and stripped them of their wealth, houses and belongings, refusing to allow them to take anything with them. And one of the most famous stories from that time was the story of Suhaib ar-Rumi, who had come to Makkah years earlier as a poor man, but through trade had built a life of wealth and comfort. Yet when he tried to leave for Medina, the Quraysh stopped him and demanded that he leave all his wealth behind if he wished to escape. And without hesitation, Suhaib agreed, saying that his faith was more valuable than any treasure. And so one by one the Muslims left Makkah empty-handed, watching as strangers took over their homes and possessions, while the Quraysh believed they had finally destroyed the movement of Islam by forcing its followers into exile. But what they did not realize was that the migration to Medina would mark the beginning of a new chapter in history, because in Medina, the believers found not only safety, but also a community ready to support them. A community known as the Ansar, who welcomed the refugees of Makkah with a generosity that astonished the world, sharing their homes, their food, and their wealth with people who had arrived with nothing but faith. And the Prophet established a brotherhood between the Muhajirin, who had migrated, and the Ansar, who lived in Medina, pairing them as brothers, so that with a desperate warning that their wealth was in danger. When that messenger arrived in Makkah, He proclaimed that they would continue all the way to Badr, where they would remain for 3 days, slaughtering camels, drinking wine, and celebrating their strength, so that every tribe would hear of their glory and fear the power of Quraysh forever. Those words ignited the pride of many warriors who had already prepared themselves for battle. So despite the warnings of more cautious leaders, the army continued marching toward Badr with nearly 1,000 men determined to prove that the authority of Quraysh could never be challenged. Yet while the powerful army advanced confidently through the desert, the Muslims were still unaware of the enormous force moving toward them, because they believed they were approaching a caravan guarded by only a few dozen men. The small group from Medina had left their homes quickly without preparing for war, because the Prophet had only informed them that a caravan carrying their stolen wealth was passing nearby. Since the opportunity appeared suddenly, there had been no time to gather a large force or heavy equipment, so just over 300 believers had joined the expedition, sharing 70 camels and only 2 horses among them, taking turns riding while the others walked across the desert sand under the scorching sun. Despite their limited resources, their hearts were filled with determination, because they believed that reclaiming the wealth stolen from them in Makkah was a matter of justice rather than aggression. Yet destiny was quietly leading them towards something far greater than a caravan raid, because soon scouts returned with news that caused a sudden silence to fall across the Muslim camp. News that Abu Sufyan had escaped with the caravan and that an army from Makkah led by Abu Jahl was marching toward them with nearly 1,000 men prepared for battle. The shock of this revelation spread quickly among the believers, because they had not set out from Medina intending to face such a massive force. They had no heavy armor, very few horses, and their numbers were less than 1/3 of the enemy they were about to confront. For a moment, the weight of this reality hung heavily over the camp, as every man understood that what had begun as a simple mission had now become a confrontation that could determine the survival of their young community. Yet the Prophet knew that he could not force his companions into a battle they had not expected, so he gathered them together and called for consultation, seeking their advice about whether they should continue forward or return to Medina. The reason this consultation carried such importance was because the Ansar, who lived in Medina, had originally pledged to protect the Prophet within their city, but had not specifically promised to fight a major war outside its boundaries, which meant that technically they had the right to refuse participation in a battle beyond the protection of their homeland. For a brief moment, the gathering remained silent as the companions reflected on the enormous challenge standing before them. Yet one by one, voices of faith began to rise among them as the Muhajirin who had migrated from Makkah expressed their readiness to stand beside the Prophet no matter what awaited them. Then the leader of the Ansar, Sa'd ibn Mu'adh, stood up, understanding exactly what the Prophet was asking without it being spoken directly. He addressed the Messenger of Allah with words that would echo through history, declaring that they had believed in him, testified to the truth of his message, and pledged their loyalty to him. He continued by saying that they would not be like the followers of Prophet Musa, who once told their prophet to go and fight with his Lord while they remained behind. Instead, Sa'd proclaimed with absolute conviction that if the Prophet commanded them to plunge into the sea, they would follow him without hesitation, and that not a single man among them would remain behind. Those words lifted the heavy tension that had filled the gathering, because they confirmed that the believers stood united regardless of the danger before them. When the Prophet saw the determination of his companions, his face shone with relief and gratitude, knowing that the small community of believers had now become a brotherhood bound by faith, stronger than fear. With that decision, the Muslims turned their attention away from the caravan that had originally drawn them into the desert and began marching directly toward the valley of Badr, where the army of Quraysh was approaching from the opposite direction. The winds of destiny carried both groups toward the same place where the fate of Islam would soon be tested in a way that neither side could fully imagine. 313 believers stood in the desert facing an army 3 times their size. No armor, no grand army, no certainty of survival. Yet that night, the heavens themselves would prepare the ground for victory. The valley of Badr lay quiet beneath the vast Arabian sky as the two forces moved closer to one another across the silent desert, a place that had once been known only as a stopping point for travelers and merchants passing between Mecca and Medina, marked mainly by a few wells that provided precious water in a land where survival depended on it. Yet on this night, the valley was becoming the stage upon which one of the most decisive moments in history would unfold. The small group of believers led by the Prophet Muhammad reached the area first and set up their camp near one of the wells, their journey having been long and exhausting under the relentless sun. Many among them still struggled to comprehend how their simple mission to intercept a caravan had transformed into a confrontation with the most powerful tribe in Arabia. Yet despite their limited numbers and equipment, their hearts remained anchored in faith because they believed that whatever awaited them had already been written by Allah. Among them were men who had endured years of persecution in Makkah, men who had seen their homes taken from them and their families torn apart simply because they believed in the message of Islam. So when they looked toward the horizon, knowing that the army approaching them was led by the very people who had once tortured them, their determination only grew stronger. But even in that moment, the Prophet did not rely only on courage or emotion. Instead, he paid close attention to strategy and preparation because wisdom is part of faith. As the Muslims settled near the well, a companion named Hubab ibn al-Mundir approached the Prophet with great respect and asked an important question, asking whether their choice of camp had been commanded by Allah or whether it was simply a strategic decision made during the journey. The Prophet replied that it was a matter of strategy rather than revelation. Upon hearing this, Hubab suggested that they move their camp closer to the wells nearest the enemy so that they could control the water supply while filling a reservoir for themselves and blocking the remaining wells, ensuring that the Muslims would have access to water while their opponents would struggle to reach it during the battle. The Prophet immediately accepted this advice, demonstrating the humility and wisdom that defined his leadership. Because even though he was the messenger of Allah, he listened to the counsel of his companions and recognized the value of their experience. So the Muslims moved their camp forward as Hubab had suggested, preparing the wells in a way that would give them a critical advantage once the battle began. This decision would prove to be one of the many small moments that quietly shaped the outcome of the coming conflict. Yet even as these preparations were completed, the reality of their situation remained overwhelming, because across the desert, the army of Quraysh was approaching with nearly 1,000 warriors equipped with armor, horses, and weapons, far superior to anything the Muslims possessed. The difference in numbers alone was enough to make any ordinary army lose hope. But the believers did not measure victory according to numbers alone, because they understood that strength ultimately comes from Allah. As the sun began to disappear behind the dunes, the valley of Badr entered a calm silence that felt almost unnatural given the storm that was about to break the following morning. During this quiet evening, the Prophet ordered the construction of a small shelter made from palm branches on a slight rise overlooking the battlefield, where he would be able to observe the fighting while continuing to pray and seek guidance from Allah. Once the preparations were complete, the believers tried to rest, though sleep did not come easily to many of them, because they knew that the dawn might bring either victory or martyrdom. Yet as the night deepened, an extraordinary event unfolded that the companions would later remember with gratitude and wonder. Clouds gathered above the valley and rain began to fall. But the rain did not affect both armies in the same way. On the side where the Muslims were camped, the rain was gentle and refreshing, settling the loose sand beneath their feet and making the ground firm enough for them to stand and move more easily during battle, while also providing them with clean water to drink and purify themselves before prayer. Yet on the side where Quraysh had camped, the rain was heavier and turned the ground into thick mud that made movement difficult and disrupted their rest. Through this simple shift in weather, Allah prepared the battlefield in favor of the believers even before the first sword was drawn. As the night continued, most of the companions eventually fell into a peaceful sleep that calmed their hearts and strengthened them for the coming day. But one man remained awake beneath the dark sky, raising his hands toward his Lord with deep humility and urgency, because the Prophet Muhammad spent the entire night in prayer, asking Allah for help. Knowing that the future of the young Muslim community rested on the outcome of the battle that would begin with the sunrise. His prayers were filled with sincerity and emotion as he called upon Allah, saying that if this small group of believers were destroyed, there would be no one left on earth to worship him. He continued praying so intensely that his cloak slipped from his shoulders while tears filled his eyes as he begged for divine support, until Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu approached him, gently lifted the cloak back over his shoulders and reassured him that Allah would certainly fulfill his promise of victory. With that reassurance, the night slowly passed as the desert sky began to lighten with the first signs of dawn. As the rising sun spread its golden light across the valley, the two armies finally saw each other clearly for the first time. On one side stood the army of Quraysh, nearly 1,000 strong, their armor shining and their horses restless, their banners waving proudly as drums echoed through the air, confident that this day would end with their complete domination over the followers of Muhammad. While on the other side stood just 313 believers, lined up quietly with discipline and calm determination. Many wearing simple clothing rather than armor, their weapons modest compared to the enemy before them, yet their hearts were filled with faith stronger than any shield. The Prophet walked through their ranks, straightening their lines and reminding them not to begin the attack until he gave the command, creating an atmosphere of focused readiness rather than chaotic aggression. As the two sides faced each other across the open ground, the tension in the valley became almost unbearable, because everyone knew that within moments the silence would shatter and history itself would begin to change forever. At sunrise, the valley fell silent. 1,000 warriors stood ready to crush a small group of believers, but by sunset, the proud leaders of Quraysh would lie in the dust, and the world would never be the same again. As the sun rose higher over the valley of Badr, the silence between the two armies felt heavy with destiny, because both sides understood that the moment had finally arrived, when words, pride, and threats would give way to the clash of steel and the judgment of Allah. The army of Quraysh stood confident and loud, with their drums beating and their warriors shouting to raise their courage, while the believers remained calm and disciplined, waiting for the command of the Prophet Muhammad, who walked among them, ensuring that their rows were straight and reminding them that patience and obedience would bring victory. As the tension stretched across the battlefield, the first challenge of the day came from the side of Quraysh, when 3 of their greatest warriors stepped forward, demanding single combat according to the traditions of Arab warfare. These men were not ordinary soldiers, but members of the most respected families of Makkah. Utbah ibn Rabi, his brother Shayba ibn Rabi'ah, and Utbah's son Walid, warriors whose reputations alone struck fear into many opponents. They called out loudly across the field, demanding worthy opponents to face them in honorable combat. 3 young men from the Ansar stepped forward, ready to meet them without hesitation, yet the Quraysh warriors refused to fight them, saying that they wished to face their own tribesmen from Makkah rather than men from Medina, whom they did not consider their equals. revealing even in that moment their arrogance and obsession with lineage. When the Prophet heard this, he called 3 of his own relatives and companions to answer the challenge. Hamza ibn Abdul Muttalib, the fearless uncle of the Prophet known for his strength and courage. Ali ibn Abi Talib, the young but powerful cousin of the Prophet, whose bravery would become legendary, and Ubaidah ibn al-Harith, an experienced warrior who stepped forward despite his age to defend the honor of the believers. As these 3 men walked into the open ground between the armies, the valley seemed to hold its breath because the outcome of these duels would set the tone for the entire battle. When the fighting began, it unfolded with breathtaking speed as Ali struck down Walid swiftly with a powerful blow, while Hamza confronted Shayba and defeated him with equal ferocity. Yet the duel between Ubaidah and Utbah was longer and more brutal, as both men struck each other heavily, leaving them severely wounded. Seeing their companion fall, Hamza and Ali rushed forward together to finish Utbah and carry Ubaidah back toward the Muslim lines, though he would later die from his injuries, becoming one of the first martyrs of the battle. With the deaths of 3 prominent leaders of Quraysh, the arrogance that had filled their army began to crack, because the opening moments of the battle had already proven that the believers were not the weak refugees they had imagined. Yet the battle itself was only beginning as the armies surged toward one another in a storm of movement and noise, swords flashing in the rising sun as the believers advanced with discipline while calling upon Allah for strength. Amid the chaos of the battlefield, there emerged one of the most remarkable stories of the day, involving 2 young boys from the Ansar named Mu'adh ibn Amr and Awid ibn Afra, who stood beside the companion Abdurrahman ibn Auf during the fighting, and quietly asked him to point out Abu Jahl, because they had heard how he insulted and persecuted the Messenger of Allah, and had sworn that if they ever saw him, they would not leave his side until one of them was dead. Abdurrahman initially looked at them with surprise because they were so young compared to the hardened warriors surrounding them. Yet when he finally pointed toward Abu Jahl, who was commanding the Quraysh forces surrounded by guards, the 2 boys rushed forward through the battlefield with astonishing courage, ignoring the danger around them until they reached their target and struck him down, leaving the man who had once terrorized the believers lying wounded on the ground. Later, the companion Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiyallahu anhu found Abu Jahl struggling in the dust and stood over him, recalling how this same man had once mocked and beaten him during the early days in Makkah when he had been a weak shepherd. Ibn Mas'ud asked him whether Allah had disgraced him. Yet even in that final moment, Abu Jahl refused to humble himself, speaking with arrogance and asking only who had won the battle. When Ibn Mas'ud answered that victory belonged to Allah and His Messenger, the tyrant sneered even as death approached, saying that Ibn Mas'ud had climbed a high place for a shepherd before finally being killed. When the Prophet later heard that Abu Jahl had died, he declared that this man had been the pharaoh of this nation, comparing his arrogance to the tyrant who opposed Prophet Musa centuries earlier. As the battle continued, the believers began noticing something extraordinary happening around them, because several companions later reported seeing figures on white horses striking down enemies with incredible speed. Warriors who seemed to appear and disappear in moments, leaving Quraysh soldiers defeated before the Muslims' own swords could reach them. When some prisoners later described being thrown from their horses by mysterious riders, the Prophet explained that Allah had sent angels to assist the believers in the battle, fulfilling the divine promise that help from the heavens would come to those who stood firm in faith. Gradually, the confidence of the Quraysh army collapsed as the leaders who had marched proudly toward Badr were cut down or fled in confusion, while the believers continued pressing forward with determination, until finally the once mighty army of Makkah began retreating across the desert, leaving behind their weapons, armor, and wounded, as the battlefield fell quiet once more beneath the burning sun. When the fighting ended, 70 warriors of Quraysh had been killed, while another 70 were captured as prisoners, marking a defeat that none in Arabia had imagined possible. The tribe that had once believed itself untouchable had been humbled by a small community of believers who possessed little in terms of material strength, but possessed something far greater within their hearts. After the battle, the bodies of the defeated leaders, including Abu Jahl, Utbah and Shayba, were thrown into a dry well near the battlefield, and the Prophet stood beside that pit, calling out to them by name, asking whether they had found the promise of their Lord to be true. When Umar ibn al-Khattab asked in amazement whether the Prophet was speaking to people who could no longer hear him, he replied that they heard his words, even though they could not answer, reminding the companions that the arrogance which once filled those men had now been replaced by a reality they could no longer deny. The Battle of Badr came to an end, leaving behind a lesson that would echo across generations, because Allah Himself named that day in the Quran as Yawm al-Furqan, the day of criterion, when truth was separated from falsehood, proving that victory does not belong to the strongest army or the richest tribe, but to those whose faith remains firm even when the odds appear impossible. From that day forward, the world would remember Badr not merely as a battle, but as a moment when a small group of believers stood with complete trust in Allah and witnessed how divine help can transform weakness into strength and fear into triumph.